Harold, your methods are legacy thinking. We're streamlining operations effective immediately. Preston Caldwell stood at the head of the mahogany conference table like he was announcing the cure for cancer, pointing his Mont Blanc pen at me like a royal scepter. You're out. I'm Harold Sharp, 48 years old, and I'd just been fired in front of the entire senior staff during what was supposed to be our quarterly business review. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Laptops snapped shut with quiet clicks, the kind of silence that happens right before a 10-car pileup on the interstate. Preston, the CEO's 29-year-old son, had just terminated me after 13 years of building the operational backbone of Pillar Systems. Called it eliminating bureaucratic bottlenecks while munching on a protein bar and checking his iPhone for what I assumed were stock prices or golf scores. I didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Just reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out the master key ring I'd carried for over a decade, and set it on the polished table with a soft, metallic clink. "Good luck with that," I said, standing up like I was heading to lunch instead of the unemployment line. He smirked like he'd just conquered the Roman Empire with a PowerPoint presentation. But what Preston didn't know, what nobody in that wood-paneled room knew, was that those keys weren't just for doors and filing cabinets. They were for systems, vendor authorizations, federal compliance frameworks, insurance protocols, emergency overrides. Some of them didn't even unlock anything physical anymore. They authenticated the infrastructure that kept our $50 million company running like a Swiss watch. You see, Preston wasn't born. He was minted at an elite prep school and polished at Wharton. You could smell the trust fund coming off his designer cologne from across the room. When his father, William Caldwell, stepped away for personal reflection after what the company newsletter euphemistically called health considerations, really a mild heart attack brought on by 30 years of building this business from nothing, the board named Preston interim CEO while they searched for actual leadership. That was 3 months ago. Today marked the beginning of the end. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. 13 years ago, I was a Navy logistics officer looking for civilian work after my second tour ended. Pillar Systems was a scrappy defense contractor operating out of a converted warehouse, surviving on government contracts that bigger companies wouldn't touch. William Caldwell hired me not because I had fancy degrees, but because I knew how to make things work when the manual was wrong and the budget was tight. I started as operations manager and gradually became the guy who knew where every body was buried. Not literally, of course, but I knew which vendor would cut us slack during cash flow problems, which federal inspector preferred his coffee black versus with cream, which insurance form had to be filed in triplicate versus quadruple. I built relationships like other people collected baseball cards, methodically, carefully, with an eye toward long-term value. When we landed our first $10 million contract with the Department of Defense, I was the one who navigated the compliance maze. When we expanded to our current facility, I handled the security clearance transfers. When the 2008 financial crisis nearly killed us, I renegotiated payment terms with 47 vendors to keep the lights on. William trusted me because I delivered results without drama or ego. But Preston saw something different when he looked at me. He saw a gray-haired relic of his father's generation, someone who talked about proper procedures and established relationships when he wanted to disrupt and innovate. During his first week as interim CEO, he told the senior staff that we needed to embrace the startup mentality and eliminate friction points. Guess who he considered the biggest friction point? The writing was on the wall for weeks. Preston started bringing in consultants from his former firm, Young MBAs, who used phrases like synergistic optimization and agile implementation without irony. They conducted efficiency audits and presented slide decks about process reengineering. Every meeting felt like a corporate buzzword bingo game where I was the only one not playing. 2 weeks ago, Preston announced that we were going paperless and digitizing legacy workflows. He wanted everything moved to the cloud, all vendor communications channeled through a new software platform, and all compliance documentation streamlined into what he called smart contracts. When I suggested that federal regulations required certain paper backups and that our established vendors might need transition time, he gave me that condescending smile, rich kids perfect in boarding school. "Harold, I appreciate your caution, but we need to think bigger. Our competitors are eating our lunch because they're not afraid of change." What Preston didn't understand, what his MBA program apparently never taught him, was that in the defense contracting world, relationships and trust matter more than efficiency metrics. Our clients weren't Silicon Valley startups looking for the next disruptive app. They were government agencies that valued stability, reliability, and institutional memory. They wanted to work with people who understood that when you're dealing with national security contracts, move fast and break things isn't a business philosophy, it's a criminal offense. So here we were 3 months into Preston's leadership experiment, and I was being shown the door for the crime of understanding how things actually worked. As I packed my briefcase and walked past the reception desk, our security guard Carl, who'd been here since the Clinton administration, just shook his head. "This ain't gonna end well," he muttered. Carl had no idea how right he was. The first crack appeared, Monday morning at 7:23 a.m., 3 days after my termination. Preston swiped his badge at the main entrance and heard that long, disappointed beep that sounds like a smoke detector with a dying battery. He tried again, jamming the card against the reader like it owed him money, nothing but that same electronic sigh of rejection. Carl, our security guard, who'd witnessed more corporate drama than a soap opera writer, just shrugged when Preston demanded answers. "System's been acting funny since Friday," he said, not mentioning that Friday was the day I'd been escorted out. "Might want to call Harold about that." Preston's face went the color of uncooked chicken. "He doesn't work here anymore." "Well," Carl said, adjusting his belt with the slow deliberation of a man who'd outlasted 4 CEOs. That would explain the glitches. By 8:30, it wasn't just Preston having problems. Half the senior staff was clustered around badge readers like confused tourists at a broken subway turnstile. The new hires could get in fine, but anyone with elevated access credentials was locked out. Preston pulled out his phone and called Ramon, our IT director, who'd been trying to make sense of our access control system since I'd left. "We've got a situation," Preston said, trying to sound presidential instead of panicked. Ramon, bless his patient soul, explained it like he was talking to a particularly slow child. The system's designed with cascading authentication levels. When the master administrator account goes inactive, it triggers a security protocol. Harold was listed as the primary custodian, so fix it. I'm trying, but the override requires biometric confirmation from the registered administrator. The system literally won't accept changes without Harold's fingerprint and security token. Preston looked at the phone like it had just insulted his mother. "Can't you hack it?" "Sir, Harold designed this system to be hack-proof. It meets DoD security standards. If I could just hack it, we'd have bigger problems than badge access." That was Monday. Tuesday brought the vendor calls. Janet from Secure Flow Systems called around 10 a.m., her usually cheerful voice carrying a note of confusion. "Hi, this is Janet calling about the quarterly security audit. We've been trying to reach Harold for the compliance verification, but his email bounced back." Linda from HR, who'd been fielding these calls all morning, explained that Harold no longer worked there. Janet went quiet for a moment, then said, "But he's listed as our primary contact for all federal compliance issues. We can't proceed with the audit without his authorization." "Well, can't you just update your records?" "Ma'am, Harold Sharp is registered with the Department of Defense as Pillar Systems designated security officer. We can't change that without proper documentation from both your company and federal oversight. Has someone else been assigned to replace him?" Linda looked across the office at Preston, who was gesticulating wildly into his phone about legacy systems and digital transformation. She sighed. "We're working on that transition." By Wednesday, the procurement department was fielding complaints. Our main supplier of electronic components, TechVault Industries, sent an automated notice that our account had been flagged for incomplete authorization credentials. Roy, their account manager, called to explain. "Harold's been our authorized signatory for 8 years, he said. Without his approval, we can't process orders over $5,000. Federal regulations require us to verify authorization chains for defense contractors." Sandra, our finance director, tried to explain that Harold had been terminated. Roy's response was professionally brutal. "I understand personnel changes happen, but until we receive proper transition documentation and new authorization forms filed with the appropriate federal agencies, your account remains suspended." Thursday brought insurance problems. Our carrier called to inform us that our liability policy required 30-day advance notice for changes in key personnel positions. Since Harold had been terminated without proper notification, they were conducting a coverage review to determine if our policy remained valid. Andrew, our general counsel, spent most of Thursday morning on the phone with various agencies, trying to understand the web of federal requirements that Harold had been quietly managing for 13 years. Each call revealed another system, another form, another regulation that specifically named Harold as our compliance officer. How did one person become so integrated into our operations? Preston demanded during an emergency staff meeting Thursday afternoon. Andrew, normally the most diplomatic person in the room, didn't sugarcoat his response. Harold didn't just handle operations, he built them. Every vendor relationship, every federal compliance framework, every insurance protocol, they're all structured around his authority because he was here when they were established. You can't just delete him from the system like a computer file. So what do? We need to contact Harold and ask him to help us transition his responsibilities properly. Preston's jaw tightened. I'm not crawling back to someone I fired. Find another way. By Friday of the first week, the problems were multiplying faster than rabbits in spring. The payroll system was throwing error codes because it couldn't verify federal tax withholding authorizations. The facilities management company was threatening to suspend maintenance services due to unclear custodial authority. Even our coffee service was asking questions about who was authorized to approve their monthly contract renewal. I spent that Friday morning at Murphy's Diner reading the increasingly frantic messages on the company Slack channel through my personal laptop. My access hadn't been revoked because Preston's team didn't even know it existed. I'd set it up years ago for emergency remote monitoring. Watching the chaos unfold felt like being a weather forecaster watching a hurricane approach shore. You can see exactly what's coming, but there's nothing you can do except watch and wait for people to realize they should have listened to the warnings. The storm was just getting started. Week 2 brought what Andrew would later describe in his incident report as cascading operational failure. That's corporate lawyer speak for everything went to hell at once. Monday morning started with the HVAC system deciding to turn our west wing into a tropical greenhouse. Someone, I suspect it was Bryce, Preston's fraternity buddy who'd been promoted to chief technology officer despite his primary qualification being the ability to set up a PlayStation, had tried to access the facility's management portal over the weekend. Instead of adjusting the temperature, he'd triggered a security lockdown that defaulted all climate controls to maximum heat. By 9 a.m., employees were sweating through their business attire like marathon runners in August. The facilities management company, Comfort Systems Inc., sent a technician who took one look at the error codes and shook his head. You need the master override credentials to reset this. Who's your authorized facility custodian? Bryce, who apparently thought custodian meant janitor, called Carl. Carl, displaying the kind of workplace wisdom that comes from surviving multiple corporate upheavals, just laughed. Son, you need Harold for that. I just make sure nobody steals the toilet paper. The technician left without fixing anything. Our West Wing remained a sauna for 3 days until someone figured out how to manually override the system by partially shutting down power to that section of the building. We lost 2 servers and a week's worth of productivity, but at least people stopped passing out from heat exhaustion. Tuesday brought the audit notice. The Department of Defense's Contracting Compliance Office had scheduled a routine quarterly review of our security protocols. These audits happened like clockwork every 3 months, usually handled smoothly by Harold, who'd maintained our federal certification for over a decade. The auditor, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Williams, arrived with a checklist longer than a grocery store receipt and immediately asked to speak with our designated security officer. Linda from HR explained that Harold no longer worked there. Margaret's eyebrows shot up like she'd been electrocuted. Harold Sharp is registered as your primary federal compliance contact. His security clearance validates your entire certification framework. Without him, your federal contractor status may be in jeopardy. Preston, summoned from whatever strategic vision meeting he'd been attending, tried to smooth-talk the situation. We're in a transition period, embracing new methodologies and streamlined processes. Margaret, who'd clearly heard every variation of corporate nonsense in her 20-year career, wasn't impressed. Mr. Caldwell, federal compliance isn't optional. If Harold Sharp is no longer your security officer, you had 15 days to notify our office and submit transition documentation. When was he terminated? 2 weeks ago. And when did you file the transition paperwork? The silence that followed could have powered a wind farm. Margaret made notes on her tablet with the mechanical precision of someone documenting a crime scene. I'm placing your facility under provisional review pending proper transition documentation. All federal contract activities are suspended until this is resolved. That afternoon, while Preston was having what Linda diplomatically called a strategic discussion with his father via conference call, Brian Patterson from Northgate Industries called about our $200 million defense contract. We'd been courting this deal for 8 months. It represented nearly 40% of our projected revenue for the next 2 years. Harold, Brian said when Sandra transferred the call, we need to finalize the security clearance verification for the Northgate project. Can you walk me through the current certification status? There was just one problem. Harold wasn't there to take the call. Sandra tried to explain the situation delicately, but Brian's response was immediate and devastating. I'm sorry, but Harold Sharp is listed as your primary federal compliance officer on all our documentation. If he's no longer with your company, we'll need to suspend contract proceedings until a new officer is certified and approved. How long does that take? Sandra asked, though she probably didn't want to know the answer. For a contract this size, with full federal security clearance transfer? 6 to 9 months, assuming no complications. 6 to 9 months. Our biggest contract, the foundation of our growth strategy, the deal that was supposed to establish us as a major player in defense contracting, suddenly on indefinite hold because Preston had fired the one person who could authorize it. Wednesday brought vendor rebellion. Our 3 largest suppliers, companies that had worked with Harold for years, extending credit during tough times and prioritizing our orders based on personal relationships, all sent variations of the same message. Unable to process orders pending authorization clarification. TechVault Industries was the most direct. Roy called Sandra and laid it out in terms even an MBA could understand. Harold Sharp has been our authorized contact for federal compliance issues since 2015. His termination without proper transition notification means we can't legally fulfill orders for defense-related components. Federal regulations require us to verify the authorization chain for all contractors. But we need those components for existing projects, Sandra protested. I understand, but until you have a new authorized officer approved by the appropriate federal agencies, our hands are tied. We could lose our own federal certification if we supply unauthorized contractors. By Thursday, Preston was starting to look like a man who'd discovered his parachute was actually a backpack full of bricks. The board of directors, previously content to let him learn on the job, was asking pointed questions about operational disruptions and delayed contracts. William Caldwell, Preston's father, cut short his medical leave to attend an emergency board meeting. According to Linda, who had a talent for being near conference rooms when important conversations happened, the discussion was brief and one-sided. How, William asked his son, did you manage to fire the one person who held this entire operation together? Preston's response, something about legacy thinking and operational efficiency, apparently didn't land well. The meeting ended with Preston being assigned a senior advisor, corporate speak for a babysitter, and instructions to resolve the Harold Sharp situation immediately. Friday morning, I got a call from Diana Walsh at Apex Consulting, former Navy procurement officer, sharp as a knife, with a reputation for salvaging corporate disasters. Harold, I've been hearing interesting things about pillar systems. Sounds like they might need someone with your expertise. I smiled, looking out my apartment window toward the pillar building in the distance. Even from here, I could see the parking lot was half empty, as frustrated employees found reasons to work from home rather than deal with malfunctioning badge readers and overheated offices. I might be available for the right opportunity, I told her. The collapse was accelerating. Week 3 brought what I can only describe as corporate cardiac arrest. The Northgate contract wasn't just suspended anymore, it was dead. Brian Patterson called Sandra on Monday morning with the kind of polite finality that feels like a funeral director asking about flower preferences. After consulting with our compliance team and federal oversight, Northgate Industries is withdrawing from contract negotiations with Pillar Systems. The authorization gaps and federal certification issues present too much regulatory risk for a project of this scope. Sandra, who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, didn't mince words when she delivered the news to Preston. We just lost $200 million. That's 40% of our projected revenue for the next 2 years. Preston's response was to fire the messenger. Not literally, even he wasn't that stupid, but he spent the next hour blaming Sandra's poor vendor relations and outdated communication methods for the contract failure. Sandra, who had 15 years of finance experience and the patience of a kindergarten teacher, listened to this nonsense with the expression of someone watching a toddler explain why the broken vase wasn't their fault. By Tuesday, the vendor situation had become critical. Our inventory was running dangerously low because suppliers wouldn't ship without proper authorization credentials. The ones who would ship were demanding payment up front, cash on delivery, like we were some fly-by-night operation instead of an established defense contractor. Wednesday brought the insurance crisis to a head. Our liability carrier sent a formal notice that our policy was being reassessed due to material changes in key personnel without proper notification. Translation: we might not be covered if anything went wrong, and in the defense contracting business, being uninsured is like being a fighter pilot without a parachute. That afternoon, Ramon finally snapped. Our IT director, who'd been working 16-hour days trying to untangle the access control mess, walked into Preston's office and submitted his 2 weeks' notice. "I can't fix problems that require Harold's credentials," he told Preston. "Every day, more systems lock us out. Every day, I look more incompetent because I can't access systems that Harold built specifically to be secure. I'm not staying to watch this company burn down because you were too proud to handle a transition properly." Ramon's resignation triggered an exodus. By Friday, 3 more senior employees had submitted notice, including Gary from compliance and Linda from HR. Word was spreading through the defense contracting community that Pillar Systems was in chaos, and nobody wanted to be associated with a sinking ship. That's when William Caldwell made his move. The elder Caldwell had built Pillar Systems from nothing over 30 years, surviving economic downturns, regulatory changes, and competitive pressures that had killed bigger companies. He understood something his son didn't. In the defense business, reputation and relationships matter more than quarterly profits or strategic visions. Saturday morning, my phone rang. William Caldwell himself was calling. "Harold," he said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and embarrassment, "I think we need to talk." We met Sunday afternoon at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the office and away from corporate politics. William looked older than his 61 years, worn down by stress and the realization that his son had nearly destroyed what he'd spent 3 decades building. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending this isn't about damage control," he said. "Preston made a mistake. A big one. And I'm hoping you'll help us fix it." I respected William, always had. He'd given me a chance when other companies saw a military background as irrelevant to civilian business. He'd trusted me with increasing responsibility and never micromanaged my decisions. But respect doesn't erase humiliation. "What exactly are you asking, William?" "I'm asking you to come back. Not as operations manager, as chief operating officer. Full executive authority, equity stake, and a guarantee that Preston won't interfere with your decisions." "And Preston?" William's expression grew grim. "Preston is learning about consequences. The board met yesterday. He's being reassigned to business development, a role with significantly less operational authority." Translation: Preston had been demoted to glorified sales rep, stripped of real power, and probably wouldn't last 6 months before finding a new job where his father's reputation couldn't protect him. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. "I appreciate the offer, William, but I've already accepted a position elsewhere." His face fell. "With who?" "Apex Consulting. Diana Walsh offered me a partnership track and the freedom to build something new instead of fixing something broken." What I didn't tell him was that Northgate Industries had already reached out to Apex about their compliance needs. Turns out when you lose a $200 million contract due to authorization problems, you want to work with people who actually understand federal compliance requirements. The official announcement came Tuesday morning. Preston Caldwell was transitioning to new opportunities while William resumed his role as CEO. The press release mentioned strategic realignment and operational optimization, but everyone in the industry knew what had really happened. By Wednesday, 3 of Northgate's competitors had contacted Apex about potential contracts. My reputation in the defense community, far from being damaged by the Pillar situation, had actually been enhanced. Word was that Harold Sharp understood federal compliance so well that his absence could cripple a $50 million company in 3 weeks. Thursday morning, I walked into my new office at Apex Consulting. Corner office, river view, parking space with my name on it. Diana had already scheduled meetings with 4 potential clients, all of whom wanted to avoid the kind of operational disaster that had just destroyed Pillar's biggest contract. Friday afternoon, exactly 1 month after Preston had pointed his Mont Blanc pen at me like a royal decree, I was sitting in a client meeting discussing a $280 million infrastructure project. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was bigger than the Northgate deal that Pillar had lost, and it was mine to manage from the ground up. That evening, I drove past the Pillar Systems building. Half the parking lot was empty. The remaining employees were probably updating their resumes and fielding calls from recruiters. Preston's vision of a streamlined, agile operation had become exactly that, so streamlined that it could barely function. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it's just letting people discover what they actually threw away and building something better with the pieces they didn't think mattered. The kingdom had fallen. Time to build a better one.